My name is Vishwas Satta. I am an academic in the International Relations Department, and I'm also the principal investigator for what is called the Emancipatory Future Studies project. Tonight we are inaugurating our project with our first public lecture, and we have with us a very, very important guest who I'll introduce just now. The Emancipatory Futures Project is really a new knowledge project. It's an attempt to understand the nature of crisis today, socio-ecological crisis, and how we can, if you like, from below and through a subaltern perspective, navigate this crisis. It's really also about methods of thinking about the future differently. We can never know the future. We can never definitely say this is the future. But there are methods of, modes of thinking that we can harness to think about possible trajectories, possible tendencies, and kind of pathways, potential pathways. So in this project, we have a Emancipatory Futures research group, which is inter- and cross-disciplinary. We have geographers, climatologists, water historians, international relations scholars, sociologists, having a dialogue and kind of keeping an eye on their disciplinary shifts around these issues and sharing that knowledge. We also have a cohort of students, masters, PhD and postdocs, and many of them are in the room. And they would be the kind of pioneers of this project, developing the knowledge around emancipatory futures research trusts. We also have a public platform, and our public platform for the next 5 years would basically be inviting scholars like Birgit and others to come and engage with us, who have expertise, who have immense knowledge around a certain topic or subject area. We'll be inviting South African practitioners. Our next speaker on the 28th of February, who's pioneering a solidarity economy pathway in rural South Africa, Mazibuko Jaha, will be with us. He'll be talking about the attempts to address or reclaim land commoning, new kinds of participatory planning, and building a rural movement in South Africa. So that's a concrete example of an emancipatory futures project, if you like. And we'll be profiling that and lots more. So, you know, this idea of the fourth industrial revolution is a real buzzword in South Africa today and internationally. It comes, I think, and Birgit will help us understand where it comes from, but I think the main platform for its origination actually is the World Economic Forum. So one of the World Economic Forum is really the modern prince of transnational capital. And Klaus Schwab, one of the key intellectuals and conveners of that space, invented this idea. He has a book out on it as well. And our elites love the World Social Forum, and they love hobnobbing with those elites. And so, you know, that discourse has found its place in our policy arena as well. We hear our president, we hear the ANC, we hear the government talking about the fourth industrial revolution. And again, you know, it's a concept that is not clear, it's not precise, it's not worked out. And but yet that's the kind of new big idea, if you like. Now, you know, this idea kind of relates to how we think about technology critically, and that's what we want to do in the emancipatory future space. We want to engage critically with technotopia. We want to debunk technotopia. So, you know, you have modernity and you have modernizing perspectives that really valorize the importance of technology. Technology is progress, okay? So if you're critical of technology, you anti-progress. Within the critical tradition, somebody like Marx had a rigorous and dialectical understanding of technology. He understood that it had immense power for social change, but he also knew that it denigrated the lives of workers. But Marx never questioned how technology was really used. And so, you know, he might have questioned capital and its imperatives, but really, the real thinker that breaks ground is Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin helps us think about technology critically in terms of its role in military-industrial purposes and in the context of the domination of nature. And he raised what was called the fire alarm. So unlike other Marxists that have venerated technology in the 20th century, the Russians, the Soviet Marxists, the Chinese Marxists, and so on. Somebody like Walter Benjamin helps us to really think more deeply about this, and that maybe social change is about pulling the brake. Maybe social change is really about asking deeper questions about technology. So to help us interrogate this idea tonight, our visiting scholar is Birgit Mahnkopf. Birgit has been a professor of economics and law at the Berlin School. She has also been a pioneer of critical political economy. Together with late partner Alma Altvater, they were some of the leading left thinkers and are around an ecological critique in the German context, and I would say their work has received attention internationally. Birgit has been engaged in various political engagements. She's been part of a think tank that introduced the idea, a red-green think tank that introduced the idea of the feedback tariff, for example. She's been very close to movements like ATTAC, which has been a powerful social movement in the European context, trying to find and envisage another way forward for Europe. And she's had a broad dialogue with the left generally, even outside the European context. Birgit has published extensively. She's done a lot of work on ecology, on technology, on political economy, and we are really excited to have her here this evening. Birgit, over to you.
So first of all, again, I want to thank WITS as well as the Emancipatory Futures program for having the opportunity to speak it to you, even though it's a topic, it's a recent topic, nevertheless, it's quite a speculative topic still, I would think so. I don't claim that I'm an expert in this topic. I'm simply a concerned scholar, and I hope that I can learn from your view on this topic. I'm coming from Europe, coming from Germany, and this will impact, as you will see, on my view on this topic. Okay. So I try my best to elaborate as briefly as possible on the so-called fourth industrial revolution, which is characterized by a fusion, strange fusion of technology, which is blurring the lines between the physical and the digital, and even the biological spheres. And this is collectively referred to as cyber-physical systems, whereas this nice picture shows you, the expectation is that robots will produce nearly everything, even robots. And well, we'll see whether this is a promising or not so promising future, which is connected to this, let's say, vision. What am I doing? Vish already mentioned that in many countries, but in particular in advanced industrial countries, including Germany, where I come from, expectations are very high. Expectations with regard to this fourth industrial revolution, and yes, the World Economic Forum is one of the pushers of this idea, but in addition, government agencies, business and employer associations, academia, and even trade union leaders, at least in my country, are convinced that digitalization of the fourth industrial revolution of the economy as well as the society at large is an accelerating process which neither should nor can be stopped. And this is something we really should discuss a little bit later. So the expectation is that the collection and the use of data, networking of all parts of production and all parts of processes, the increased use of robots, scanners, actuators, and in particular the use of artificial intelligence and algorithm enabling data-based production organized from something very called the cloud. That with this as a background, we will, yes, will be close to paradise, namely increase efficiency and flexibility of production, of logistic, of administration, will increase, by the way, also energy use in a more efficient way, but also will help to protect our agricultural systems and, well, help smart mobility and smart housing systems to exist, and, well, also will produce new opportunity for small and middle-sized corporations across the world, and not to forget, will provide a huge amount of new smart consumer goods which would enrich people's everyday life. And by the way, and not as last issue, yes, it's also the promise that upgrading of jobs and the substitution of stressful, unattractive and dangerous tasks will be possible with the help of these new technologies. So, to put it in a nutshell, one can say what is expected is a new wave of mass consumption, stimulating economic growth, and, by the way, sustainable development based on data as a new lifeblood of capitalism. This would be what? This is the promise in a nutshell, I would say. So what I will now try to do is very well, obviously only in a very primitive way, to share with you some of my problems I have with this approach. The first is referring to technological bottlenecks which stands in the way of a widespread use of digital infrastructure. Secondly, it's not very clear how far digitalization can be linked to societal goals and in particular to employment creation in the favor of workers. But in addition, I think it must be considered something which usually is not mentioned when people are enthusiastic about digitalization and Industry 4.0, that the technologies in mind are dual-use technologies, which means that they can be applied for civilian as well as military purposes, and this has a huge impact, yes, on the industries. And the fourth point I want to make is that I will question the promise that ecological sustainability can be reached with this, with this move toward Industry 4.0. So I try to argue, I try to give you some hints why I'm very skeptical, and we'll see whether you share with me my criticism or whether you are much more optimistic about the tendency I will touch. So first, the topic of the technological bottlenecks of the digital revolution. I will first refer to the countries of the advanced, the countries where you have an advanced industry existing, even though I refer actually to a very small group of countries, but I come back on this. But even in the advanced industrialized hemisphere, let's say, there is a lack of fiber optic networks as a basic technology necessary for fantasies coming later. To install these fiber optic network, it's very expensive, and the question is who is financing it? And if government is financing it, you know, what is government no longer financing when it's financing these networks? So this is a crucial issue. So meaning that you have these networks not even installed in most of the European countries, not to mention countries outside the European Union. You have it to a certain extent in the US, and you will have it in China, but definitely this is a bottleneck and it has to be overcome before we can talk about the rest of the fantasies. Secondly, standardized application programming interface is necessary, it doesn't exist so far, and only this would enable us to have this communication between these different sorts of smart goods. And in addition, there would be the need of a common data language, still not existing so far. but also the integration of largely self-sufficient system from such diverse areas as production, logistic, energy supply, but also building management. It's simply not there and has to be developed. So one could argue, well, this is also some stuff for the engineers, this will happen in the next future. So let's ignore this for some second. But the last point I have there, which is danger of cyber attack. Well, this is something even more serious. So cyber attack can happen both from inside as outside the companies, the firms, by computers. It can happen by computers, it can happen by social networks, it can happen by what is characterized as the cloud, which is simply the connection of all this, and it can happen by nefarious organizations. These cyber attacks will potentially and very easily can understand it when you imagine our infrastructure, like water, like electricity network, how easily they can be attacked. You will imagine that this is not only dangerous with relation to our everyday life, but we already know it's very dangerous for democracy and for privacy. I will not touch on these topics here, but simply because there is not even any sort of solution for this type of cyber attack even under consideration. So for developing countries, or what in this discourse on digitalization something turns out to be the rest of the world, well, the bottlenecks are even more severe, I would argue. So access to quick and cheap internet access, it would mean at home and not in internet cafes, is definitely much more difficult in a lot of developing countries, and usually it's also more costly than in advanced industrialized countries. Furthermore, the high vulnerability of ordinary cybercrime already shows up when it comes to financial services, which is already done to a huge amount in Africa, as I know, but also the cases reported in terms of data breaches as well as social engineering attacks against financial sector actors in Africa in the year 2017 was double than before. So one can expect that there are dangers in particular where the networks are less secure. Well, it's all relative, because also in our country it's not really secure, but at least a little bit more secure, I guess, than in some of the developing countries. But where the situation of developing countries is much poorer than in the developed world is the area of artificial intelligence. And one has to understand that one can profit, in the sense of the promises, only if technological sovereignty can be reached in the near future. And technological sovereignty would mean that you have a close value chain available from chips to computers to batteries to software. Actually, this is not the case in the developing world, including all the middle-income countries, but actually technological sovereignty will determine whether gains in employment will come from digitalization. This is something one can at least be sure about. So I tried to not to give too many graphs, but at least some should illustrate my argumentation. So one can say very simply, the most important measure for digitalization is production and sale of robots. Yes, also the production of 3D printer, but also the use of smart platforms as well as digital products are an indicator of digitalization, but what is most important is the production and the sale of robots. And when you look at what the International Federation of Robotics published in October last year, you can see very easily that what is expected for the next years to come is a tremendous rise in robots being produced and sold in Asia, followed by Europe, and then they are insane, mentioning here America, actually they mean the United States, but that's what they are doing. So Africa is not even here in this graph. But you know, when they look at the other graph, well, I have given the numbers from the research done by them. So 0.5% of all robot sales in 2015 were in Africa. So it's not production, but sales. This is an even more important graph, I do think, because what it shows us, first, that the number of installed industrial robots per 10,000 employees in the manufacturing sector, and this is what Industry 4.0 is about, is concentrated in simply 75% well, 75% of all sales of robots is concentrated in just a small number of 5 to 6 markets. With at this time still South Korea at the top, followed by Singapore and Germany and Japan. Well, this will change. This will change due to what I recommend to you to watch. I was unable to integrate it in my PowerPoint for technological lack of capacity. Swiss corporation ABB Information System recently is building a huge robotics factory in Shanghai, and the purpose of this factory is to build robots. So it's a factory where robots will build robots to be installed across China, but also in other places of the world. And this will change things tremendously. So China, which is in this chart, you know, at the very end, I swear you, in a very few years, will move to the top countries profiting. So with regard, as I already said, to Africa, still the production but also the use of robots is very, very small. The use of robots mainly in manufacturing industry, followed by logistics, and then comes medicine, also agriculture, you know, in the sense of milking robots, but defense, and therefore I will include defense here, is catching up quite quickly. So what is the impact on labor market and employment? Well, also here we have to distinguish between the advanced industrialized countries and, well, I put it here as developing countries, not distinguishing between emerging economies and developing countries, because the split is obvious. So what is expected for the advanced developing countries, in particular those few you have seen there, it's a tiny number of countries. It's South Korea, it's Japan, it's United States, it's Germany, and not the other European countries that much. Here, what is expected is an increase in labor productivity, even though you have a lot of debate in foreign circles whether one can really expect a high increase in labor productivity due to digitalization, but let's take it as an expectation seriously. So the expectation from the vanguards is simply well, that they will grow on the basis of increasing labor productivity, and that's what the resources, that's the research, you know, I give the research here always in the brackets in my paper. You can find the resources, the sources written in the whole lens. So what is expected is that there will be an decrease in average cost of production, which then, as expected, can boost output, increase export, and therefore increase maybe also labor demand at home. So yes, it's expected that also in the advanced industrialized countries a lot of jobs will disappear, but it's expected that due to the fact that we, let's say Germany, is exporting robots to the rest of the world, there will be increasing demand on labor in Germany, so that there will be, you know, on the balance sheet, a positive aspect, a positive result. While there is also a very important study by Fry and Osborne, already done in the 15th for the United States, arguing that the overall effect will be negative in terms of employment. They have done it for the US labor market, but similar results exist also for Europe, but obviously not for Germany. For those countries in Europe which are, well, less advanced in terms of manufacturing, such as Romania, Portugal, Bulgaria, Greece, a decrease of employment of 40 to 60% is expected as well. But in Germany, so far, Germany is next to South Korea, the country where, in relation to the number of employees, the biggest number of robots are already installed and working. In Germany, so far, there was until now no reduction in total employment, which could be traced back to robotization of the industry. And yes, therefore it makes sense from a German perspective to argue, well, it's a promise, we can profit from it. The idea behind is, well, for Germany, the backbone of the industry still is manufacturing. Manufacturing costs 80% of German exports. And so the idea is, well, we will export these machinery. Well, it's nothing else than exporting unemployment abroad. So exporting more unemployment abroad, because we already do it to a large extent. Well, when we look at the developing countries, well, actually we can say, well, the impact is still low. There are very few robots already working, installed, but this will change. So it's expected that up to 50% in some countries, much more, I come back on this, of all occupations may be impacted, and in all sectors may be impacted by the installation of robots doing the job. For the World Bank, it seems to be clear that what has been the case in the last decades, namely that the manufacturing of for exports will no longer be a pathway to growth for middle and low income countries. This is a finding of the latest World Bank research from last year. Also, ILO, from its report last year, assumes that machines, robots, computers will increasingly have an absolute advantage and no longer only a relative advantage, a comparative advantage over labor. And for some countries, in particular the East Asian countries, the Southeast Asian countries, in particular Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, it's expected, so these countries where during the last decade a lot of supply chain work has been installed in sectors such as electrical appliances, electronics, but also clothing, footwear, and so on, that these countries will suffer a huge loss in jobs. So for the ASEAN 4 countries mentioned, it's expected by the ILO that 60 to 80% of all workers might lose their job in the next 10 to 20 years. This is not only the result from ILO, but also the Human Rights Outlook is referring to this finding, arguing, well, as a result, we will see something else, not only a loss in jobs and loss in livelihood, but we will also see a spike in slavery and labor abuses and trafficking, because who will be most impacted? This will be the millions of women who has been integrated in these global supply chains during the last decades, and they will be the first to lose the job, because the rest will be then kept by the men. So this is the expectation. You can find these estimations in these different sources I've given here. So just for a glance, what does it mean? You know, we take a graph. You can see here, this is from the ILO research done on the subject, the share of employment that is susceptible to automation. Here is estimated, well, for a huge number of countries in the global south to be 40 to even 70%, and you see South South Africa there. So even though one can sometimes hear South Africa views itself as one of these vanguard countries in terms of digitalization, but so far robotics are neither produced nor sold from South Africa, and therefore it might be correct. I cannot judge, nobody really can judge about these numbers and estimations. Please take it as estimations. That also here in this country, maybe 50% of jobs may be impacted in one way or in the other. While in the Asian countries, as I said, the impact will be much higher. So these are the sources. You can find it in the ILO research done, where it's all grouped and presented, and you will see, well, there are some research quite optimistic, but mostly with regard to advanced industrialized countries, and there is really no research optimistic for developing countries. Well, in World Bank research you find, well, they assume it might be that in the production of 3D printer, Brazil may catch up and may fulfill their some role, but this is simply guessing, and it's not really elaborated further. The only thing I found, it might be my ignorance, but I looked around what I could find about Africa. So the only thing I found so far, you know, in my preparation for this lecture, was a research done by the British Overseas Development Institute, also from last year. And what they have done, they are in particular referring to Kenya from their perspective. Kenya is a leader of digitalization in Africa. I don't know whether this is correct, but they took indicators such as internet penetration rate, but also undersea fiber optic cables, even though undersea fiber optic cables don't tell anything about the fiber optic cables you would need to have onshore in order to connect all these smart firms and products, plus a number of other policy measurements installed in Kenya. Why they think, well, actually digitalization has not yet led to substitution of labor in Kenya. And they ask the question, should African countries continue to pursue a manufacturing-led development path, taking the argument of the World Bank into account that this is no longer a development path for the global south. They looked, they have done the research, I think quite nicely. I cannot judge about this. And they assume that actually, first, Africa will not be impacted that negatively as, for instance, Southeast Asia, because the technological change is particularly taking place within global value chains, referring to the computer industry, to electronics, to transport. So many parts are produced and assembled and then put together and sent abroad, while this, they assume, I think correctly, is not that much the dominant form of integration of Africa into the global economy. So they come up with an interesting recommendation, and I think we should discuss it in the very end, because I'm not an expert. I simply give you what I have found in the literature so far. They recommend to build up industrial capacities in Africa in less automated sectors, and they give the examples here for food, beverage, tobacco, metals, basic metals, wood products, paper products, and other non-metallic minerals, arguing that this might act as a kind of window of opportunity to take local production and organize regional trade until the mid of the 2030s. Because the argument is, and they try to show it with increasing wages in a country like Kenya, their argument is the latest in the mid of the 30s, robots in the furniture industry, which is somehow linked to global consumption in Kenya, robots at this time at least will become much cheaper than labor in Kenya is. And then labor will be competed out by robots. So that there will be a window of opportunity to install something like local production and regional trade in these areas, which are less automatable, let's say, is a very narrow window, not that long. So what I always click on the one side. So what can be added as well from this research, which I found for me at least very interesting, is that they have looked at what is happening with jobs which now on the basis of robots installed in the United States. So actually the United States, you have seen it in the other graph, is this industrialized country where compared to South Korea and Germany, much less robots are working until now. Still, what you can see here, when jobs are reshored from Asia, from Latin America to the US, from Africa it's only a few, then you see, well, a lot of jobs get lost in the countries from where the reshoring takes place, but they don't show up in the same numbers in the United States. So this is for sure, yes, there will be reshoring and new jobs appearing again in the advanced industrialized countries which had disappeared in the other regions, but now the numbers will no longer be the same. That's for sure. Well, if I don't have the same sort of interesting research for Europe existing, I guess the numbers would be much more impressive, because I know that there are a number of German, for instance, footwear producers like Adidas, for instance, already having reshored much of their production to Germany and doing the job with robots now. Well, it's not only in terms of quantity of employment, we have also to take into account, well, what I would, in a way of not to extend too much on this issue, I would argue, well, we can expect job losses will appear everywhere, or even though to a different amount, but there will be also a profound transformation of work if this digitalization really takes off as these institutions and responsible persons are hoping for. Most certain by automation and robots obviously will be office and administrative jobs, including all kinds of secretaries. Low-skilled jobs in manufacturing, such as textile, clothing, footwear, electrical and electronic, and call centers which has been established in developing countries, will be impacted quite a lot. But further, one should assume that there are strong changes, at least, also going ahead with job losses, but also, but much more important, is the change in the job content and the way job work is organized. In farming, as I mentioned, milking, robots to be installed, in particular in the advanced industrialized countries, but maybe also in developing countries. I have no idea whether this could be the case. But definitely in retailing, in publishing and banking, in trucking, and even in jobs like the job of a lawyer or a radiologist, and even teachers will somehow be impacted by the introduction of digital equipment doing part of their job. It would not mean that they are that these professions disappear from the market, but the content of their job will change dramatically. And for the high-skilled workers, let's say the core workers in the manufacturing industry, one can assume that digitalization will go together with further elimination of work, with an acceleration and more intense work, with more work stress and not new challenges for work-life balance. So taken together, I think that these are quite unpleasant perspectives which could hollow out low and middle income jobs and create even more low income jobs across the world. This is something one can see here in this graph, taken from this very famous research from Frey and Osborne. They can see only what is what is yellow, what is blue and green, which is computer and engineering and science stuff, but also education and healthcare and intellectual and technical services, in addition to legal and community services. Only this is expected not to be impacted by computerization, adding to something like a little bit more than 30% of employment in the United States, while the rest will be impacted. So it doesn't mean that the jobs will disappear, but the content of the jobs, the structure, the organization will change tremendously. That's what can be taken. I skip this in order not to be too long. So from what we can definitely expect, from at least from my point of view, is that there will be an increase in precarious jobs, in precarious work on the digital labor platforms, which are an important part of digitalization, because without these labor platforms, Industry 4.0 would not work. So from the perspective of the employers, it's very clear that, that digitalization helps them to rely less on a permanent workforce, as they already do, that they will hire even more on demand, as they already do, that the employment relationship is limited much more to a kind of work assignment, and consequently new jobs will lack a clear organizational allocation, meaning that firms tie the the workers had to the firms, and trade unions will have even larger difficulties to communicate with employees and more even to represent their interest. Actually, all routine work in all kinds of profession are subject to offshoring. So digital service will have to divide each kind of job where the computer is somehow connected in ever smaller parts, and these smaller parts are and will be to a growing extent delegated to virtual workers. Virtual workers who can perform their task within some seconds sometimes, and therefore these tasks are also remunerated with only a few cents per task. So in a way I would argue what is emerging on a global scale is the click, or if you call them click or cloud worker or micro worker or worker on demand. So you know, these are different wordings, but actually for the same sort of activities. So people sitting somewhere, very often at home, but they are forming a new type of mass worker. A type of mass worker who is no longer concentrated in a factory, but is dispersed across the world. Meaning that workers with very different social backgrounds and very different professional experiences are competing against each other. So you will see, and you already have it now, that students as well as single mothers or pensioners in advanced industrial countries are competing with engineers in India who have to live from the same salary. It's not a salary, it's the cents they get for their job. Even though the Indian engineer have to feed a whole family of 4 children. And some of these students, and maybe the pensioner in the US who's doing the same kind of, well, click or cloud work job, have the same experience on the one hand, meaning that they have low and erratic earnings, that they are often isolated and very often absolutely invisible as workers, that they suffer by incorrect classification, so very often being coined independent contractors instead of workers. It's difficult, it's really difficult to find and to use national jurisdiction in order to regulate this type of work, because it's very unclear which kind of jurisdiction you should take. And you see a vanishing of the division between work and private life. This is actually the case for all these clique or crowd, or yes, clique, crowd, micro workers. But the problem is neoliberalism has in the meantime also infected the minds of a lot of people, in particular in the advanced industrialized countries. So very often they even don't see what they are doing as work, even though in other parts of the world, those who are competing with these people, young people, educated people, have to live from the income, from this clicking. And this is something which is really very difficult, because when you don't see them yourself as a worker, but as a self-employed or your own boss, or you do it simply just for fun, or as pensioners sometimes say, due to boredom, but you compete on a global level with others who have to do it for the sake of the family. We see a new informal economy emerging on a global scale, which is much more difficult to deal with than the informal economy that you see in the streets of the global south. So the new normal, or the new norm, I would say, the new standard of work which is emerging in parallel with this digitalization and this Industry 4.0 is the subjugation of workers to unstable employment, low wages and lower income, more dangerous working conditions for some, no regular social benefits, often denied, also are the rights to join a union. And for those still working as a core workforce in factories, so let's say for the German car workers who see themselves as beneficiaries from this process, just doing some surveillance work with regard to their computers, well, it's the fact that they are now controlled by apps and by algorithms, which is somehow the equivalent to the old assembly line. But the problem is, you can't stop algorithm and apps as easily as you could stop once assembly lines. It's nearly impossible to stop them. So in a way, I would argue what we see is a capitalism of digital platforms and algorithms which make labor discipline more rigid, as it imposes seemingly scientific measurements and evaluations you cannot really doubt anymore, because artificial intelligence has come to the result that this is correct. But the key difference to old manufacturing is that workers, in exchange for their submission, discipline, are not getting the benefits, the social benefits and the wages and the political representation they were able to get, at least fight for to get in the old system. Now let me at least briefly touch to the second point. A second point which is actually not existing in the debate on digitalization in Industry 4.0. It seems to be as it would happen on another asteroid. The problem is that autonomous systems, be it autonomous driving systems, be it drones delivering parcels, or be it drones in agriculture identifying how much fertilizers are necessary now, or be it autonomous control machines in the energy sector, they need the same sort of technology as autonomous weapon systems. So it's definitely the same sort, and this is given here in the blue area in the center. Sensors, emission recognition, software systems for autopilots, GPS, large databases, and in particular, powerful computers. Actually, this is the material base of both the autonomous system in warfighting and the autonomous system to be installed, or already are installed, in industry and manufacturing. And I give you here, I cannot elaborate on this, some examples. It's not future talk, when it comes to military and defense issue, we can see these instruments already. One is from the German army, the Bundeswehr, the others from South Korean army, water defense. In the middle, you see the combat drone, which exists in huge numbers in the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army, in its in a paper from 2017, has declared that it will integrate automated weapon system into the army forces, fully integrated between 2030 and 2014. So what is going hand in hand with this, we could discuss this, but it's usually not taken into consideration when people talk about digitalization, that it will revolutionize war fighting in such a sense as, well, it will be the machines and no longer human beings which will decide in milliseconds between friend and foe. And they will even do it in the so-called unanticipated situations, meaning that when it is very difficult to identify whether a target is an old lady in a wheelchair or soldiers just on the brink to surrender, or a so-called terrorist you are supposed to kill, so the machine will kill anyway, because the machine is not able yet, and it will not be able in the next future, as I read so far, to distinguish between these objects. Furthermore, the so-called proportionality in war fighting is you cannot expect from machines. So what is meant with this is, well, usually humans have to identify whether it's really worse to kill the one enemy, the one terrorist or whatever, or to destroy the one subject, the one object, taking into account that also a whole hospital and 50 children will be killed. A machine simply is unable to consider this, because this is about morality, whether you take this into account or not. Machines cannot take this into account and will not take this into account. In addition, and this will be the result of it, war fighting will become much quicker, because one machine will react on the other. So it's the US, it's the Chinese, it's the Russians, but also the French army and the NATO. They are very much engaged in developing and, well, after you have it, using all of these weapons. So one can say digitalization has to be taken as a backbone of coming hyper wars and also of the cyber wars, meaning that you don't sometimes have to send a weapon. It's sufficient to destroy or impact on the computer systems of your enemies. In addition, we have to see, and I cannot elaborate on this here at length, but at least you should take it into consideration when speaking about this aspect of digitalization. Well, actually, if data is the lifeblood of capitalism of our time, then those who collect and control data are those who are able to control the world, also war fighting. And that's what you already see, the so-called GAFAM complex, which is Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. They are the ones heavily connected with the US military. And what, one could elaborate on this in detail, but the internet comes from the former military ARPANET, and since it has been developed in the Cold War area somehow, you always see the same corporations engaged in either doing something for the military or getting something from the military for their civil operation. And Google is in the center of it. So Google Earth you might use, and Google Maps actually comes from Earth Viewer from the US Army. And while today Google is developing with its TensorFlow recognition software, which is used for civil purposes as well as for the military purposes. But there's competition still going on between some of these corporations. So Amazon is merging up and becoming one of the most important and the strongest, it's a very strong contender for a new project launched called JD. Well, it's competing with IBM and Oracle on stuff like, hosting secret data, supporting agencies for the Justice Department, or powering national immigration case management, or storing hundreds of millions of ID documents. So you see here a very, very close relationship to what we once have called the capital military complex. Today we have to call the digital capital military complex in the US, and you can assume that the same exists in China. We have only very few knowledge about this, but that's what you can assume. This is a paper you can read. It's not secret what the expectation of the US Army are with regard to integration of automated weapon system in the next future. So now let's come to my last point, the last point of my reservation against this Industry 4.0 stuff, which are the ecological constraints. As I mentioned in the on the very beginning, the expectation that it will also help us to reduce our energy consumption. It can be better adapted to our real uses, and we don't waste that much energy, and we can connect all the smart products with each other so that we, as a result, will have less energy consumed. So this is one of the promise. I think it's absolutely misleading, this promise, because what you will see is that data, even if it's today taken as a new oil, data also have a material base, which on the one hand is fuel, namely energy, and on the other hand, when it comes to the digital equipment, it's metals you need to produce this stuff. And finally, the problem shows up with more of this digital equipment. You have also more very problematic toxic leftovers which cannot be recycled due to the low recycling rate which do these metals have on which these products are based. So this is one of these centers you usually don't see when you speak about the cloud. Actually, this is a cloud. It's not one. There are dozens of these computer centers existing in the United States, also in other countries, but mostly in the United States. And in China, we don't see these in China. The problem with these data centers is they are consuming so much energy that it's expected that the information and communication technology already in the next year, so in 2020, will demand 1/5 of Earth's power. So it could become the biggest polluter in just 7 years if the amount, of digital and other, digital information communication equipment will increase in the same amount as it has increased in the last years. And what is the most interesting number here, which is based on research of somebody who obviously he's doing it for Swedish agencies, but he's well respected in the academic community, calculating the global the use of big data centers, including global energy usage of these communication technologies, and he has calculated that in the year 2020 already, so next year, it could be, and it will be, that all these data centers will consume 200 terawatt, which, in order to give you an idea what this would be, this is half of the energy consumed for transport worldwide. And if you imagine that this will go on for the next 10 years, it's really horrifying, because you can imagine what this would mean in terms of energy demand and the and also in terms of pollution linked to this energy demand. And the recommendation done, well, then use renewable energy sources, which Apple already does. It advertises its iPhones that it uses now renewable energy sources, and Google also does it for its newest type of data centers. The problem is you can use it then not for other purposes. So it's not that you have so much renewable energy available, and if these data centers are consuming it, it will not be there for other more relevant consumption purposes. The other argument I've made, well, we should see it's not only that these, this digitalization consumes energy to a very horribly large amount. It also needs materials. And these materials, well, I know that usually people are a little bit irritated when I give, it's only a selection, but the most important metals you need for digital equipment, but unfortunately you need the same sort of metals, most of them are the so-called rare earth elements. You need the same sort of metals, in particular minerals, for the production of renewable energy technologies such as solar panels as well as wind turbines. You need it also for the transmission of fossil fuel into energy, and you need it for modern military systems. So what we will see is definitely supply chain risk, and maybe even more, on minerals and metals increasing due to the fact that we wanted to have this all in parallel. The modern warfighting, the Industry 4.0, but we want also have a green transition which more renewable energy installed. And with electric cars, if you would really calculate what even substitute half of the cars we have recently on planet Earth through electric cars, you would need such an amount of lithium, it's absolutely unclear where it should come from within the next period of 20 years. Well, and you can argue, well, then prices will go up. That's always the case in capitalism. If there is shortage of some kind, prices go up, yes. And this means that only very few will have access. And this brings me to the last point, which is linked to this issue of, well, competition on metals you need for different kind of purposes. Again, this is a graph. It has been produced by the German Raw Material Agency. Actually, it's somehow a government agency, calculating. It has calculated in its report from 2016 the global metal demand for only 42 of the future technologies which are linked to Industry 4.0. I tried to translate it here, what it in there, so electric cars, wind power, medical technology, fiber optic cables, solars, seawater desalination plant, and so on, displays in particular, these high solution displays, photovoltaic. When you take these technologies, that's what they have done, and they calculate. They have calculated, you know, the increasing demand from the year 2013 to the year 2035. And what you see there, it's a doubling, a trebling, a quadrupling in terms of demand for just this tiny period of time. And the big question is, where should this demand, where can this demand be covered if you take into account that the resources, and this is the last point referring to this, are concentrated, well, I make it with the other one, which is more impressing, as you said. The resources are concentrated quite heavily in a few number of countries. And what you see here in red, and therefore I like this graph so much, because it gives you, with one glance, the idea what's really the problem behind geopolitical conflict coming up, because most of these minerals are concentrated, not all, but most are concentrated in China. And China is something particular, because in comparison to Africa, where also a lot of metals, but not that many minerals, some minerals are in Africa, but most of these minerals needed for the new technologies are concentrated in in China. The problem is they have the minerals, they exploit, so they extract the minerals, they process the minerals, and they are able and willing to produce also the final goods out of it. So, as China has already succeeded in competing out European producers in solar panels, the next they are capturing are the European producers of wind power technology, and the next will be electric cars and other equipment needed for Industry 4.0, including the robots I have mentioned before. So this is a case where you can see huge geopolitical conflicts coming up, because you cannot have access. Well, what China already did in the past was restricting its export of these raw materials in order to keep it. Now it was a conflict with the European Union and the US before WTO. Now they have decided, well, we simply extend production. That's what they have done. So they have even more production of these metals in order, well, not to risk immediately before they are able really to dominate the market of artificial intelligence, and they will dominate it because they have one thing which no other country has, a huge amount of data which they can collect and can use for different kinds of purposes. Therefore, this is something behind. Obviously, it's much more behind. I cannot elaborate on this, since we all know there's a social dimension behind, because when you do mining for these rare earth minerals, the problem is they are only in tiny quantities, in huge amount of rocks. They have to be disconnected with a huge amount of water, with a huge amount of toxic elements, and so you have an environmental impact which is very, very severe, as well as you have conflicts regarding land ownership and rights of indigenous people. So it's not at all that the digitalization is a clean and sustainable pathway, I don't think. In addition, just giving it as a hint, even though you know it, I don't want to refer to the recycling issue, but you know, those metals have a very, very low recycling rate. So recently they have a recycling rate of 1%, and even if you quadruple it through technological progress, you still end with 4%. So what is done, as you know, is that the advanced industrialized countries, where most of these products are produced, in the future, with the help of the robots, they will send even more of this toxic stuff abroad, send it abroad to landfill sites in Africa and in Asia, where it ends to be recycled in a very problematic way. And this is a movie which just has been shown in some small cinemas in Berlin. It has the title "Welcome to Sodom." Your handy is already there. So that's what the title of this movie says. So, and you see here a guy in Agbogbloshie in Ghana, which is one of the most toxic sites, doing recycling of copper, namely burning the plastic around the copper, because even though you might argue why copper is available in a lot of places, well, copper will be one of these metals, even though it's not a rare earth metal, but a traditional one, which will see huge shortages in the period to come, because there might be a peaking very soon due to this huge demand of copper needed for digitalization. And yes, we know that it would be in principle possible to recycle material inputs, but for this to happen, but we could also reuse the still functioning cellular telephones, as we know. But for this, first, higher recycling rates would be needed, which is not the case, because up to 70 different metals are in your cellular telephones, and it's definitely very, very difficult to disconnect them. And the other thing is, yes, it would be easy to use these products, if you would repair them, if you would include standard products which you can easily disconnect again, and if you simply would sell software updates instead of forcing people to buy new ones. But this would cause companies losing profits, and we are still in capitalism, and the losing profits is not allowed. So instead we are convinced by marketing and advertising that we have to buy always new stuff. So I'm coming to the end, and instead of a conclusion, well, as I mentioned, I will not touch on the more complicated issue of privacy and impact on policy making and on democracy, which is all connected to the ownership and use of big data, but instead I formulated some questions. I have questions I cannot answer, but maybe we can answer it together. And give me, so which is already here, so 2 minutes or 1.5. So the one question I want to discuss with you is which position could and should labor and trade unions favor? First, and the few vanguard countries, the 5, 6, maybe 7, I don't know, in the global north. So coming from Germany, as I told you, German Trade Union Confederation is very much in favor, as nearly everybody in Germany, of Industry 4.0, arguing, so these are quotes, that they want to accompany and to help shape the process because they hope that, well, for the core labor force, that the core labor force can participate and get further training to adapt to the challenges to come. So you have to know, German trade unions never wanted to be seen as machine breakers, and this is more frightening for them than anything else. Well, and in parallel they try to organize some support for those mess workers, as I have called them, you know, the self-account workers or the micro workers, or those, well, who are officially declared to be independent workers while actually not being independent workers at all. They provide them with some tools for online organizing, and I have also some nice message to bring to you. So at least in the Netherlands, in the last month, a court has ruled that the couriers of the food delivery company Deliveroo remain in an employment relationship as defined by Dutch law, which is a huge success, I would say, so that it's now possible for the Dutch Trade Union Federation to represent workers of the Riders Union, as they call themselves, so that they don't have no longer to see themselves as freelancers, and negotiation can start. And the Dutch drivers of Deliveroo has expanded their activities to Belgium, now also trying to support the Belgian drivers to escape this definition of being a self-employed. And yes, you see also in Germany that the Food and Allied Union tries to support what is called, just happened last week, the second Riders' Day. So we are not in a situation where a court has ruled that they are no longer self-employed but workers. But this is really the very few stuff I can report from there. I would like to know from you, so from people, and you know, as cynically the World Bank is calling it, the rest of the world, so those not belonging to those 5 or 6 or maybe 20 countries who might become the winners of this digitalization. How would you, will you deal with the job losses which will appear, with the decreasing wages due to the increasing use of robots, which will be cheaper than even cheap labor in developing countries, at least in manufacturing, and with the increasing political instability which will result out of it. And the last question, and this is for me the most important question, I think so, is what can government do? So yes, I can say what what I see as possibilities, even though I'm not really convinced that they are, that even if this could happen, that we are escaping the mess. But yes, government could restrict access to and the trade of data of these big data corporations. They can refuse to sign international trade agreements, which recently has been signed between EU and Canada, but also between the different Pacific Rim countries, which deprive governments of instruments to regulate the digital economy, meaning they allow data to flow free without even attempting to stop them somewhere. They could start to develop their own, and it cannot be a national, it must be a regional infrastructure, let's say an African infrastructure. And this, I think, and that's the only progressive debate I could figure out so far in Europe, that it must be a collectively owned infrastructure, which then can maybe also be used by communities in order to well fulfill their digital needs so far. And yes, I think governments could, but we are very far away from this, could establish something like a multilateral regime of resource governance, which must be determined by, I think so, by the supplying countries and not the consumer countries of raw materials, which are running out in a way. And yes, we can, government could ban automated weapon system, since these violate the UN norms of human rights. Well, actually, the most basic question for me is, do we really need Industry 4.0? And how far should digitalization shape societies at large? Because it will impact also on healthcare system, on education. I have not mentioned it yet, but we have also, in particular, take the trade-offs into account, which are mentioned in relation to raw materials and energy. So, yes, I simply stop here in order not to extend too much, because this is my habit.
Yay! That was excellent. So we'll open it up to comments, questions, engagements. Anybody? Patrick?
I'm very, very sorry we're going to have to run, but I just think we have maybe two things that South Africans are doing really well to lead the world's fourth industrial counter-revolution. One is intellectual property, which is so central to control of big data and all the capitalist accumulation going with it. And we've had a movement here that has taken away intellectual property from big pharmaceutical companies, and as a result, getting AIDS medicines for free raised life expectancy from 52 to 64. The second part that you can do enough on, in my view, I'd love to hear more, is, I have to run, I'm so sorry, but surveillance. And we have extremely sophisticated counter-revolutionaries here in Johannesburg. Many of us actually were part of this movement that drove here tonight. And we went under Austrian sort of cameras, surveillance cameras, and we did this to them. We ignored them. It's called an e-toy. So our fourth industrial counter-revolutionaries in Passat, now to, again, cutting edge and defeating big multinational capital. I mean, the third is the vanguard of the 4ICR, a South African, who says that if you put artificial intelligence together with robotics in the factory and you open the door, it's game over for humanity. And he knows, his name is Elon Musk, and he has a famous film that you can download, which is called, Can You Trust This Computer? So I hope everyone can read it. So I think this is one of the most important things as we collectively socialize technology and find collective ways to resist in the same spirit you are. Have you heard of these fourth industrial counter-revolutionaries? Are you one of us, comrade? Sorry, I'm feeling.
Anybody else?
Just wanted to find out what are the, since you have mentioned that there's so much need for energy in the future for the data centers, obviously worldwide there's going to be a huge demand for energy. Already South Africa is backing as far as energy is concerned. So now, I just wanted to find out why why wouldn't there be more mobilization into maybe research into renewable energies? Because obviously there's going to be far much higher demand than it is now. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, firstly, I suppose, thank you for this presentation. I think one of the biggest frustrations for some of us who are sort of critical of this notion of the fourth industrial revolution is that in South Africa, I mean, if you were to open the newspapers on a Sunday, I mean, you firstly see the adverts from the University of Johannesburg talking about the future is here, we have imagined it, and so there's this uncritical approach or embrace towards this concept of the fourth industrial revolution. And I must say that the critique that you provide is a critique that I haven't heard before, and I wasn't actually even. It's not something that I would have thought about the false promise of this particular so-called revolution. But just to say that some of the things that you've identified are quite important, and at least, I mean, from my experience in interacting with some workers, I mean, the question of surveillance is quite big. Surveillance on the shop floor. There's certainly that feeling that we sort of got from some of the workshops that we've done around this question. The question of, I mean, surveillance through face recognition, biometrics, and many other ways in which digital technologies have actually changed the shop floor. And the question of the work intensity, but also people now suddenly needing different skills for jobs that they've done for decades is quite a big thing. And workers, the way they describe it is that this is quite degrading in some ways. And when you're degraded, you don't have the energy to learn new things because you just feel that you're completely useless for this. There's also the question of that maybe I'd like to get your comment on this a little bit about how the consumer is sort of involved in the regulation of the labor regime itself. When I think about what other people have called platform capitalism, the fact that we are the ones that actually rate the worker, whether the service was good, you give 5 stars or 4 stars, but you're completely unaware that you are actually having a say on whether this person keeps the job, gets a promotion, gets an increase in terms of their wages and all of that, which is, yeah, all those questions are quite important. But I think that question you asked about which position should or could labor take, I think it's important to highlight that, I mean, there has been some form of response from the unions. I mean, you highlight the German unions. I know IG Metall speaks about the humanization policy, but there's also been a pushback in other instances, and I'm thinking here about the strikes across Europe from Amazon workers who were rallying behind the call "We are not robots," which was big on Black Friday. So perhaps you can comment a little bit on that. Thanks.
You can stop there. So.
No, Patrick is already gone. So responding to Patrick, well, actually, it's yes, there's also discussion in leftist groups in Germany now. How could we get access to, well, our property, which in this case is data? And there is now also a decision taking that at the European level there should be some sort of regulation, but this is mainly going into the direction of finding a way to tax these big data corporations, because this is the point, we want to profit from what they are gaining by collecting and using the data of millions of people, and it's actually not really an approach where we say, well, we can get access to our, let's say this is our property, our data, but the problem is, you have mentioned it indirectly, people really don't care. They have no understanding that each information they give and take, both give and take, when they are using this equipment, their cellular phone or whatever, the computer, that this is something like, yes, part of gold for these corporations who bundle it and sold it for some purposes to others. well, in such a way, I wouldn't say that we don't have in Germany or in Europe no discussion about the dangers when it comes to the surveillance part. You know, surveillance in terms of I might be controlled by these big data corporations, but there is really very few debate on what you have touched in your comments, namely that the surveillance of the shop floor, you know, which is done on the basis of the same sort of collections. You know, that it's not only that people when they are working are under the surveillance, also the collection and the personal offices today are done with the help of artificial intelligence. You know, when you apply for a job together with 2,000 others, the first selection will be done by artificial intelligence. I know in Germany there is still co-determination, but in the United States it's already allowed to do this. You know, and there's a huge pressure coming from the industry saying, well, actually it's not more dangerous than simply picking something out. I have to do the collection anyway from these 2,000 appearing. So let's artificial intelligence doing this. So it's approaching step by step, and you know, you see it also in teaching, in the teaching areas. You know, it's a, well, actually, if there is so much repetitive work for teachers, you know, let some program do the job. And Microsoft is selling it very cheaply, relatively cheaply to German government, these programs, and also to other governments across the world. And yes, then it at the first glance it seems to be that it's a reduction of boring work you have to do in former times. So let's be happy about this. Well, what you have mentioned, that people to a growing extent are experiencing also loss of skill. Yes, this is I think something which will appear in the future to come. Well, you know, always looking at Germany as the wonderful IG Metall, who had once done its humanization project. Have you any idea how many decades ago? You know, it's really decades ago. What we now have in the factories are a three-class society, you can say. You know, that the core workers, they are very educated, they earn a lot of money, and you have then those who are there as contract workers, and you have workers there working for other companies. And you know, there is a lot of surveillance done, and there is no equal pay for these type of jobs. There is actually no solidarity. Well, what you have mentioned with regard to Amazon strikes, Amazon workers there, they don't feel in the authority of the industrial trade unions. You know, those who organize Amazon workers are the public service union in Germany, and they are the ones who are fighting quite heavily as far as they can, because their power is much more limited than the power of the industrial unions. They are fighting for those who are really impacted in this area of being a casual worker, of being contract worker, of being well, not part-time worker, because you know the amount of time you work sometimes for a corporation is so low that you even can call them part-time workers. So actually, yes, we have to distinguish between the industry and the rest of our economy, and I see that unfortunately those who see themselves as vanguards are not willing to organize something like solidarity, even on a national scale, not on a European scale, and what it will be on an international scale, I have no idea so far. So I would be happy if you can convince me that there are much more positive examples existing where solidarity can be organized and is organized, and that they should look it up in order to become more optimistic, as I am now. But you know, what I have done, really I have done because I was so frustrated about the discussion going on in Germany, because there is only the same as you have mentioned when looking into South African newspapers. There is only this one line, this one focus, you know, we have to do digitalization of schools, of factories, of hospitals, even care work, you know. Yes, I can imagine that it's more easy for a computer to move a heavy old person, you know, from the one side of the bed to the other. But you know, what it will would it mean that when also the medicine is given by a computer, you know, and you say, well, I can use the caring person for better purposes, and simply the stupid activity of giving the right medicine at the right time. You know, what you have is these minimal shifts which after a period of time shift a lot, you know. And I think because Vish has already mentioned in what he has said at the beginning, what we really lack is a critical debate about technological progress. You know, it's something like we are blind when it comes to technological progress. Nobody wants to be against technological progress, even though we know that we were not able to control technical progress in the past. Why should we be able to do it in the future? And therefore, the more fundamental question is, what do we really expect from technological advances? Which do we want? Where do we want it? And where do we have to fight it? And this is something which really is not very welcome nowhere, I guess, when we start this type of discussion.
Before we move to the last round of questions, there was a question about research on renewables.
Well,
and the role of
actually, your
consumers.
question, there
role
is
of
not a
consumers.
lack at all of research in renewables. So this is not the question. This is not the question. It's simply a power question. It's a power question on the one hand between the brown energy producers and the green energy producers. It's a question of the fact that you can use renewable energy not in the same way as you can use oil and gas. It has a lower impact in one quality, return on energy invested. So you have to do less when you use the same amount of renewable energy. And this is something we don't want to do. We don't want to do less. We don't want to move less. We don't want to have less. You know, and this is something which is not possible on the basis of a move toward 100% renewable energy. We have then also to understand where we have to do less, to get less, to move less. And you know, this is something which is another very profound debate, you know, to have renewable energy used in order to consume that much energy for these purposes would mean you don't have it available for cooking energy for poor households and in rural areas. You don't have it available for intelligent transport systems to be installed in urban areas, and so on and so forth. You have to decide for which kind of purpose you want to use it. It's not there. It's not the case that you can use renewable energy in much bigger quantities that you have until now used fossil fuel. You have also to change your usage. And this is something which nobody really likes to know either.
Okay, so last round, there's Eddie, Michelle, and okay, that hand is John. Eddie first.
Well, thank you, Birgit, for a very informative talk. And particularly the challenge you presented at the end about essentially what is to be done. And I see this as an intellectual and political challenge. But I want to take it from where I stand in the south, in South Africa. And famous quote of Ecological, what you see depends on which side of the mountain you stand. I stand here, and 4 kilometers from here is an abandoned gold mine. And every morning, men, and occasionally women, go into the bowels of the earth with ropes. And they use chisels. And they use the telephone, the cameras on the torches on their cell phones to guide them. In other words, they're not going into the fourth industrial revolution. They're actually going back into non-technological. That's the reality in the city of gold. There are over 400 of these abandoned gold mines in Gauteng alone. So I have 3 real observations. I mean, the first of them is, I'm not sure, I don't get the distinction point between the third and the fourth industrial revolution. I mean, and it's interesting, when you spoke of examples of job loss, you talked about automation, but automation is the third industrial revolution, not the fourth. So I'm just wondering, is this a gimmick we've got from the World Economic Forum, that there's a fourth industrial revolution? Of course, I'm not an expert on this, but it's more of a question, really. The second one is, how does that narrative fit into the global south? First, second, third, fourth. Well, I think we're still in the second last. In fact, we're struggling to get into the second, because that's around electricity. That's what the crisis is all about at the moment. So I think that it's more of a challenge to my colleagues that we need to develop our own narrative. And it may not fit that teleological 1, 2, 3, 4 when we look at our own country. But then there's just a third point, and then maybe it's really contained. It's more of a suggestion. What can governments do? You know, there was a wonderful debate a long time ago by a fellow called Samir Amin. And he spoke about delinking. That was his response to global capitalism. Now, delinking, it didn't mean, that you go around smashing the machines maybe it's a relative delinking. It's a little bit like what you're saying there, but it gives an interesting intellectual and political pedigree, because when you say develop your own infrastructure, he's the most serious left intellectual we produced in Africa. His position was that the task of delinking is not to break your links with the rest of the world, but to prioritize local needs, to prioritize local interests, to develop your own path. So when you say develop your own digital infrastructure, and that's a kind of a Samaritan type argument. And I'm mentioning this because it's got a long intellectual pedigree in our left project here in the South. And it may be one way of thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. John.
Thanks. This was great. It was a great conclusion. Yeah, thanks. It was a wonderful conclusion to the 3 days. So I just have a question. It kind of builds a bit on Penny's, but from a different angle. There's a recent book called Inland Shift. And the point of this book isn't the digitization. It's talking about Southern California and the way in which the logistics companies there's become an inland logistical port in Southern California. But one of the things that this book shows is that actually there's been companies like Amazon have used migration and the fragility of labor to not digitize or industrialize. In fact, they use it to hyper-exploit. So these workers have no power, no access to any kind of legitimacy, so that they can basically exploit them even more extremely than anyone else. So migration is actually confounded. So for Amazon, in this book they argue, Amazon hasn't mechanized these warehouses and things where usually it's these machines put these things right onto the pallets, that use pallets and stuff. And here, they've actually done away with pallets and they have human beings packing in so that they can pack everything, and they save a ton of money by not digitizing. So it seems that this north-south, the south is in the north as well, but it's the south, because they took the reshoring has actually led to just a relocation of the south, but actually some of, and actually if you want, he does have a hopeful kind of scenario where their labor community and some environmental groups come together. So there is a moment of hope in the book too, if you want examples.
Thank you, Michelle. John?
Yeah, this may echo something that Patrick Bond and Eddie reminded us in the last comment. What is missing from this discussion? Obviously, it's a big subject. You can't include it as politics. You can't. There's no politics in this discussion, and that's understandable given that you had an awful lot to cover in the short period that you had. However, which government is going to present on this subject matters. I can't imagine that a Chinese dissident could come here and talk about the fourth industrial revolution in China and return home safely. You can come from Germany, which is a fairly homogeneous country. You can get the Korean to come down, the Ambassador Kim come down. He's written a book on development in Korea, what it might mean for South Africa, and we're going to debate this here. And America's going to debate it in democracy. So is German democracy survivable for the fourth revolution or not, do you think? That's one just little quick aside. And have you read anything about the fourth industrial revolution in political terms? Judge Verde in the United States says the Anthropocene will be democracy or it won't be horrible. Can democracy survive? But just do with Germany for a second. Is German democracy going to survive the fourth industrial?
That was the last hand.
Please speak loud, I have really problems to understand.
You asked the question, do we really need the fourth industrial revolution? I will talk about the mining sector. Automation has affected majority of occupations in the mining sector. Over the past 10 years, half of the occupations that are found currently in the mining sector are non-existent. And you mentioned earlier that Germany has not been affected much. Well, we said in Germany, so far robots have not reduced employment. But in our case, when you look at the mining sector, there has been a reduction of employment due to automation. So the question then becomes, what happens to the people that do get affected? Because the majority of them are people that are not educated, firstly, and they are occupied in occupational levels that are semi-skilled and unskilled. So then, what would you recommend us to learn from Germany? What would be the key, what lessons can we learn from Germany for people who do occupations due to automation? Because I would like to differ with the perception that you said Africa will not be affected. We are already affected. People are losing their jobs. So what happens to those people that cannot go back and study to keep up with the educational levels that come with automation and mechanization in the mining sector?
Okay, thank you.
So actually I think a lot to Eddie, because he has mentioned very important issues. You know, I gave this stupid graph in the very beginning, and one could discuss at length. You are absolutely right. Automation, which is always, you know, part of the story, obviously in this graph was addressed to the so-called third industrial revolution. When you go, there's a lot of, because it has been given to me these Industry 4.0, but you know, when you would look to a debate in Japan, you will see they are talking about the sixth industrial revolution. It depends, you know, how you frame your own industrial history. So, well, this was a shift in our economic history, and now we see it as a new step. But actually, you are absolutely right. Automation is something we already have since a long time. Therefore, I can connect it to the last speaker. Well, we have obviously the rest of mining, which has been done or still is done in Germany, is done on a so highly high grade of automation. You cannot even imagine, you know, how high this automation is. So you cannot see that robots will really change a lot. Workers, miners in Germany still are, you know, only surveilled in terms of the machinery. Nevertheless, you know, there are no lessons you can learn from Germany. Because, you know, we are a very rich country, you know, and when talking about mining, you know, we just recently had a huge social conflict on phasing out coal power plants. I don't want to explain to you the whole story, but, you know, to explain it to you in a very simple way. We only have 30,000 miners, and these miners are high-skilled persons, operating already robots, so it's not that anything will change, and to keep these people in their job of surveillance of, this machinery, this is really absolutely stupid. You could also have given them good training so they could do something else for the rest of their life. But it has been decided differently to keep these mines operating until at least the mid of the 30s. So there is nothing you can really learn, for instance, from this mine. Our mining industry has already been changed 20 years ago. And we have a lot of money available to move these people to other sectors, which obviously is not the case in the countries of the global south. And therefore I will come back again to the second argument Ellie has made, which I think is really the only way to handle these issues. Not always to pick up what is offered in terms of discourse from either coming from the World Economic Forum, or I have learned there has been a conference, I guess in Mozambique last year, maybe, where IBM was offering, I don't know, so many millions to Africans, in terms of getting digital education, this is very tempting, in a way to, well, we want to be updated, therefore we have to follow this. I think it's much more important what you have said, delinking, so discussing what you really want, what you really need, and it might be that you really need some sort of digital communication and also digital services for some purposes, which could really help. And as I can imagine, instances of emergency where you can definitely use a drone in order to transport medical equipment to an area, a remote area, which is very difficult to access due to weather constraints or due to the upcoming, more often coming, and so-called environmental disasters. So a lot of purposes where you can imagine that these technologies make sense, but for this, you have to start first debate what is it, what is really new about it, and what is it what we want to have. And the second thing, and this is really the more challenging thing, is really, how can we build up something like a regional network we can use, And I think, yes, there are qualifications existing in Kenya, in Nigeria, in South Africa, and I guess also in a number of other countries. And it would be really, a big undertaking to bring these people together from science, from industry, yes, also from industry, those who are interested in engaging in this, in order to bring up something which is really adapting to needs of African population, and this is not happening. It's also not happening in Germany. It's not that somebody is asking, is this really what we need, Yes, you can buy, this is always my example in order to illustrate the stupidity of what is promised there. That consumers get new products, and this would stimulate growth, and growth stimulates the increase of jobs. What kind of product is it what the consumers are promised that they will get? For instance, that your door opens without touching anything, only because you have implant here a chip which opens your door. So what? I can use a key, or a toaster in the morning. A toast, your contact file will be printed in the toast. It's fun, for one time maybe, but not to see yourself every morning, right? So you would like to have a normal toaster maybe. So actually, all these questions are not asked. So where is it where we could use technology? Let's call it digital technology because it's more. It's definitely that you don't have to connect different equipment directly. You can order, you can demand this equipment even if this equipment is quite far away. So actually, this is the most impressive additional privilege it gives to you, but what we really have to discuss what we want, and you have to discuss what you need, and then you also have to resist, because this will be part of the problem, you know, that a lot of jobs will simply disappear because it seems to be cheaper to do it at home with the help of robots. So, you know, the reason why China is engaging so much in this robotic stuff, it's simply the case that Chinese labor can no longer be cheap, because they are graying much quicker than the European as well as the US society. So they will have a huge amount of elderly people in the nearest future, and so their wages can no longer be cheap. And you know, so the Chinese companies are afraid, you know, how can we then survive on the market? And this is the reason why they develop so much these robotic stuff. We have to see, well, there's always a national purpose also behind, or regional, because you can also take China as a region. And this has to be discussed, I guess, in more detail. Therefore, I've given this last question because, you know, these are the most important questions. And from my perspective, this is all advertising. I don't see the so-called fourth industrial revolution coming. I have written a paper, and I always have put it in what do you say? In vertical, because I don't see anything like it. And I see one industrial revolution, and this was a very profound one. And for me, there is no other. But you know, this is something else. Because it's about, you know, the shift to fossil fuel, and we have still not left fossil fuel, and there is no other industrial revolution. Also, this technological based on fossil fuel, and if they are basing on renewables, then they have this trade-off. The question: do I have missed something? Yes, you know, but actually, I have to confess. In order to answer your question, I would definitely need 2 more hours. I cannot now speak about democracy. This is something very different. Yes, obviously, this type of technology will have a huge impact, a very negative impact on democracy, because you already see that when you depend so much on these networks, and the social media network, is very, very difficult to pass through anything you think would be relevant in order to organize something like a consensus, even on a national base, not to speak about a regional or global base. Therefore, there is an impact of this technology on democracy, but actually I don't see that. What I know what you have in mind when you say Chinese would not be able to speak in such a way on this issue. Well, actually, all Chinese speak about this issue, but in a very different way. So I had a lot of Chinese students, and the last Chinese students coming, they were not able to speak about anything else than about artificial intelligence. And it took me a whole semester to convince them that there are other things on planet Earth which are more relevant than artificial intelligence. So they are speaking and they are engaging voluntarily and optimistically, and you know, it can become crazy. It's not the authoritarian state. All Chinese students, 20 years old students, they are enthusiastic, they want to contribute to bringing China up to the leading power in artificial intelligence, you know, and yes, you have to do something against this, but you know, this is a question of how to educate people, and it takes quite a long to make them a little bit nervous about this. But this is not the question of authoritarianism. It's not a privilege of Chinese government, I swear you. I see a lot of countries in the meantime across the world which are following this route, and this would be actually, even though I would like to talk about this, but this is another thing, and I'm not allowed to take it up.
Okay. Well, very, very big thank you to all of you for coming. If you please sign the register, Birgit's written a paper for us, and we are happy to share it with you. So please make sure you